So we are so pleased to have Salamisha Tillet here with us tonight to talk with us about how ending violence against women can change the world. Salamisha Tillet is a rape survivor, scholar, and writer. She has spent her career championing the rights and voices of our most vulnerable citizens. She was nominated by Glamour magazine as Woman of the Year and named America's Top Leaders Under 30 by Ebony. Currently, she's an associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and has faculty appointments in the Department of Africana Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Salamisha and her sister, Cher, who is also here, co-founded A Long Walk Home, which is a nonprofit that uses art therapy and the visual and performing arts to end violence against girls and women. She's also the writer of A Story of a Rape Survivor, which is an award-winning multimedia performance that tells her own story of reclaiming her body, sexuality, and self-esteem after being sexually assaulted in college. She's a writer. She's appeared on CNN, NPR, writes for The Nation on issues of race, gender, and popular culture. And she has a book out that's called Sites of Slavery, Citizenship, Racial Democracy, and the Post-Civil Rights Imagination. There's so much more I could say about Salamisha, but I'm gonna go ahead and welcome her to come talk to you all, and then after she talks to you, we're gonna bring up a panel of local advocates to continue the conversation. So welcome, Salamisha.
So good evening. This is nice. Chicago's so lovely. This is my, well, I should say it's my favorite city in the world. It is my second favorite city in the world, but I really am a fan of Chicago for a number of reasons. It's my sister's home, and it's the home of the nonprofit we founded, A Long Walk Home. But it's also a place of really rigorous and honest feminist activism, and I feel like I've come of age in Chicago as a movement maker, a movement leader in this work to end violence against girls and women. So I just love Chicago for a number of reasons, but it's such a place of dynamic energy and social change. And so I don't know, we do this work all over the country, but Chicago is really special for the ways in which you really intersect and address violence against women in really creative and progressive ways. So thank you for that, Chicago, and thank you all for being in the room tonight. Okay, so I'm gonna begin, and I promise I will walk around, and I promise I won't read my whole talk. So those are my two promises tonight. I would like to begin my talk this evening by thanking a number of people and organizations. First, the Illinois Humanities Council, Alice Kim for the initial invitation, Jeffrey Banks and Paula Bowie for arranging my travel and making sure I got here on time and with a smile. My fellow presenters, many of whom I've had the pleasure of working with or who have inspired my own activism. Claudia Garcia Rojas, Sharmila Majumudar, did I say it kind of correctly? Kind of, I understand. People do that with my first name, so sorry about that. Natalie Moore, Jay-Jin Pak, and Beth Ritchie. And finally, I would like to thank my own sisters in struggle, my colleagues and comrades from A Long Walk Home, my literal sister, Scheherazade, and my colleagues, Leah Gibson, Maureen Jackson, Sangi Ravichandran, and the young youth leaders of Girlfriends who are here today and who I promise I'll give a special shout out later on in this presentation. So it's a deep, deep honor of mine to be in such esteemed company. So, this idea of the Cafe Society is really quite beautiful, and I feel like if we can transport ourselves back into the 1940s to the Cafe Societies in New York, where Billie Holiday and a number of artists and activists would get together and push forward a progressive agenda, we are, inheriting a legacy of really radical work and an intersection of art and activism. So it's just a beautiful concept, and I like the fact that it's traveling and also digitized, right? It's the Cafe Society of the 21st century. And so one of the themes, when I was initially invited to give this talk today, there was a theme that at least the Illinois Humanities Council was pursuing, is the idea of masculinity and mass media. And so my talk today is going to think about that and how masculinity and violence against girls and women intersect, and I hope that you will follow me as I explore the good, the bad, and the hopeful of that. And it is also my hope that we can begin a really fruitful dialogue tonight and have a rigorous conversation afterwards, both in the panel discussion but also in the Q&A. So my original talk, How Ending Violence Against Women Can Save the World, pursues a line of thinking that is in large part a descendant of or an extension of a short piece I wrote this summer on George Zimmerman and domestic violence, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the new title, Interrupting a Culture of Violence Against Women, gives me an opportunity to expand that premise as well as speak about my own coming of age and my own involvement in the women's movement. So it's almost 20 years ago, which seems amazing to say out loud, that I first published my story of being a survivor of multiple sexual assaults in the campus newspaper at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a feminist campus newspaper called, and this is my generation, Generation XX. And in that story, I told my experience of being sexually assaulted when I was a young girl, my experience of being sexually assaulted when I was in college, my freshman year, and then my junior year when I went on a study abroad program. And it took me time, it took me effort, and it took a lot of work and recovery to be able to use media, even if it was a small campus newspaper, to reshape or change the conversations about sexual violence. This was in the mid-90s, and we've come a long way since then, and we still have a long way to go. And so this moment of interruption, this intervention, helped me understand the crucial role that art and media can play in changing the public conversation about violence against girls and women and helping individuals and communities heal from such onslaughts. That insight was further, there you go. That insight was further advanced when my sister Scheherazade picked up her camera to document my recovery process. For 10 years, she has not only captured the intimate and interior moments of my healing, but through touring soars has invited other artists, activists, and students to enter the world of a rape survivor and center our daily stories and lifelong struggles for justice, power, and visibility. So this is the backdrop of my talk tonight. As a rape survivor and as a cultural critic, I'm quite concerned with the representations of violence against girls and women in US mainstream media. That concern prompted me to write a series dedicated to this subject last summer for The Nation, a series for which I initially thought I would not have enough information, at least not for a daily blog. And if anyone blogs here, I do it yearly, but I'm not a blogger per se. It's really hard to come up with a topic every day and have something new and insightful to say about it. And so I thought the topic of violence against women, which I'm quite familiar with, may lead to like a weekly blog, but I didn't think I'd be able to generate so much information in such a short period of time. And there was a lot that happened this summer. I wrote about Serena Williams' response to the Steubenville rape case, or the verdict in the rape trial. I also wrote about the sexual violence in Tahrir Square this summer. I wrote about the sexual harassment case with Mayor Bob Finley in San Francisco. And I also wrote about, for example, the new Netflix series, Orange is the New Black. So those are just a taste of what I was able to write about in a short period of time. And so what I realized is that if you simply start paying attention to what is always there, you will understand that violence against girls and women is every day and everywhere. So just quickly, because this is a word that we use in the field, gender-based violence, but this is a kind of a snapshot of how the spectrum of violence, or at least the forms of violence that are targeted at girls and women, these are a snapshot of that, the kind of a listing of what we think about or what we define as part of this spectrum of violence against girls and women. And while these forms of violence are not exclusive to girls and women are disproportionately experience them, right? So 1 in 5 women has been a victim of rape, and this is US statistics. 1 in 4 women report intimate partner violence, and 1 in 3 Americans are primary or secondary victims of gender-based violence. And despite the last statistic, most Americans, and there's a study done by the Novo Foundation about how, it was a focus group, and how do, like, kind of the average American, how do they think about these issues, and what would take them to go from feeling empathy or sympathy for the cause to creating action. And so the stats were kind of illuminating. While 95% of people, for example, think it's a health issue, only about 45% actually think it's like a big health issue. while 55% of the people in the focus group said that they believe there should be funding towards gender-based violence prevention programs, only about 35% actually want to use tax dollars for this. And what the researcher deduced was that usually when you have an issue that causes so much sympathy on the part of American citizens, there's a sense that we will use our tax dollars to address it. But when it comes to issues of violence against girls and women, there's a split, right? We should do something about it, but we shouldn't necessarily designate tax dollars towards it. And also, one of the things that came out from the study is that people may not actually know who the enemy is, like how do we organize around this? And so there's a change in consciousness, but there's actually very little political will. And this is where we are right now. So part of what I want to do here tonight is figure out how to change our current conversation about gender-based violence. I want us to think about it as the root cause of other forms of violence and exploitation in our world. I want us to think about it as an important but often overlooked and unchecked indicator of whether or not individuals will go on to commit other violent acts. And I want us to think about it as the single biggest predictor of whether or not a country will go to war or be in a state of peace. And this is an expansion of a thesis that I will talk about a little bit later from a book that just came out in 2012 called Sex and World Peace. And so when I ask us to think about violence against girls and women in this way, what I'm doing for a brief moment is shifting the burden of the ripple effect from thinking about how it impacts survivors like myself to thinking about how these perpetrated acts of violence by certain individuals lead to other acts of violence in a larger culture, right? So instead of thinking about, in our fields, we usually talk about, well, violence affects the girl or the woman, and then it affects the community, and then it affects this country, and then it affects the world. That's one way of doing it, and I think it's really useful, and I'm actually going to return to that at the end of the presentation. But I do want us to think, and I'll show a number of case studies to get to this point. I want us to think about what happens when this initial act of violence against girls and women happens, and if it is unchecked or overlooked, what are the other forms of violence that can happen as a result? So, 3 C's for us to use for this conversation are, I want to change the conversation, I want us to build a critical mass, and I also want us to create or participate in an ongoing movement, a global movement, a US-based movement, a local movement, right? There are all these different movements around ending violence against girls and women, part of which you're, participating in tonight. So what's the current conversation look like? You can challenge me and you can debate me on this, and I would love to hear more opinions about this. This is just my brief synopsis here. So there's du jour topic, there's victim blaming, and there's declension narrative. In terms of topic of the day, right? So there are all these stories that you hear like every month. There's a new rape case, there's a new domestic violence case. And so the media responds without, as if it's a single case as opposed to seeing a pattern of violence, right? So our current case, I don't know if anyone follows college football, much less the Heisman Trophy candidates, but so some of you know, Jameis Winston is arguably the person who's going to win the Heisman Trophy this year, and it was just earlier this week, the prosecutors in the state of Florida said that they will not pursue sexual assault charges against him. And so ESPN has been the media outlet that's primarily covered it, but you do see CNN and other outlets covering it. But I just want you to think, it's like, 2 months ago it was Maryville. There's always a new case that comes up that we respond to, and then we kind of leave. Victim blaming is the most obvious and pretty consistent, and this is Ms. Foundation did this, kind of cheat sheet based on mainstream media outlets' responses to the verdict of finding the 2 young men guilty of sexual assault. And so CNN said the boys were promising students, ABC News made excuses for the rapists, NBC laments the boys' promising football careers, and US Today stresses that the victim was drunk, right? So part of what happens is that there may be an over-identification with the perpetrators of violence and a lack of sympathy or empathy or even belief in the young person who comes forward, whether it's a teenage girl or whether it's a young woman or when men come forward as well, right? So there's I call it kind of, it's the Pavlovian effect. We're so accustomed to blaming the victim and overly identifying with the perpetrator that the media and most individuals have this kind of quick response when we hear about an act of sexual violence or rape. And and this is something that may be familiar to you, may not be. There's a notion that violence in the world is decreasing. And Steven Pinker, who's a psychologist at Harvard, has this very successful book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And the thesis is this: believe it or not, the world of the past was much worse. Violence has been in decline for thousands of years, and today we may be living in the most peaceful era in the existence of our species. And so when Steven Pinker argues this, one of his rationales is that the formation of the nation state, the creation of different discrete countries around the world, late 18th century, early 19th century, created an era or an aura of peacefulness, right? He calls it the long peace. But what's ironic is that, if you don't think about violence against girls and women as part of how the nation is created, then you will think about peace that doesn't recognize that violence against women in many countries, if anything, is becoming more prevalent, not less so, and dwarfs the violence produced through war and armed conflict, or is part of the violence produced through war and armed conflict. To say a country is at peace when its women are subject to femicide, for example, or to ignore violence against women while claiming, as Pinker does, that the world is now more secure is simply wrong. And so I have a couple of case studies that I'm going to go through pretty quickly to make this argument. So I think we're all familiar with the Ariel Castro case, right? In May of this year, he was charged with 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of rape of Amanda Berry, Gina De Jesus, and Michelle Knight, women he imprisoned and tortured over the course of about 10 years. He pled guilty to 937 criminal counts of rape, kidnapping, and aggravated murder, and he was sentenced to over 1,000 years. And about 1 month into his sentence, he was found dead in his cell, and this is, of course, up for debate. And if you're skeptical and suspicious like me, you may think, well, what exactly happened? But the prison authorities have deduced that he committed an act of suicide. Less known about Ariel Castro is the violence that he inflicted upon his wife, Gramilda Figueroa, over a 12-year period. According to her sister, after the couple moved into their new home, all hell started breaking loose. She and her husband claimed that Castro beat his wife, breaking her nose, her rib, and her arms, and once threw her down a set of stairs, cracking her skull. In 1993, Castro was arrested for domestic violence, but was not indicted by a grand jury. In 2005, she accused Castro of inflicting multiple severe injuries on her and of frequently abducting his daughters. A temporary restraining order against Castro was granted, but was dismissed a few years later, and she died in 2012 due to complications from a brain tumor. The next case I wanted to, and I'm going to build an argument, but I'm just going to give you how I read these cases first. The next case is George Zimmerman. And he's notorious for the fatal shooting of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012. And in July of this year, was found not guilty for second-degree murder or manslaughter. And so this case was primarily seen through a lens of racial injustice. And a lot of the narrative was about a kind of long story of interracial violence against black boys in particular, from like Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. That was a lot of the public discourse about the case. And today, I think we have a better sense of George Zimmerman's proclivity towards domestic violence. These are 2 separate cases, one in September of this year, when his now ex-wife accused him of domestic violence, of threatening her and her father with a gun. And the second one happened within the last month with his current girlfriend, who is pregnant, and she called 911, and she, again, also said that she was being threatened at gunpoint by George Zimmerman. And recently, she has said that the police misinterpreted her story, but I think that a lot of the media response today sees the pattern of domestic violence with George Zimmerman because of these recent cases. However, and this is one of the recent stories, I think on Think Progress, where it said what George Zimmerman's story can teach us about domestic abusers. And it's a good piece, I think, in many ways. But I feel like the story should flip a little. Instead of thinking only about what George Zimmerman's story can teach us about domestic violence, what does George Zimmerman's domestic violence teach us about his proclivity for racial violence and for other forms of gender violence? So I want to look at 2 cases or 2 different forms of gender-based violence that George Zimmerman was accused of doing or perpetrating before Trayvon Martin. The first came up, and this all came up during the pretrial, right? So the media covered this story. This is why we know of them in the first place. The first is known as witness number 9, and this is the part of what I talked about in The Nation. A younger cousin of George Zimmerman who claimed he molested her for 10 years when they were both children, beginning when she was just 6 years old. 2 years younger than George Zimmerman, she said she was scared of him because he was bigger, older, and stronger. She never went to the police, she said, because her mother told her that cases like hers become he said, she said. And the other part of this quote is that his family had the ability to cover it up. And this was in the Miami Herald. One media response from a really progressive or liberal op-ed writer in the Washington Post was this: Jonathan Capehart, an African-American op-ed writer for the Washington Post. My heart goes out to witness 9. She suffered abuse that she says traumatized her, and she suffered in silence. It wasn't until 2005 that she said she told her sister. George Zimmerman was later confronted at a pizzeria in Florida. He apologized and left. These allegations brand Zimmerman as a predator and a creep, but they aren't relevant to Zimmerman's current predicament. This was the other story that came up during the pretrial, and actually in the bond hearing. It actually came up in order to prove that he wasn't capable of violence. His then wife was questioned about this story, but this was published in the Miami Herald as well. In 2005, Zimmerman was also involved in a domestic dispute with his ex-fiancée, hair salon employee Veronica Zazo. Zazo claimed Zimmerman was trolling her neighborhood to check on her. At her apartment, they spoke for about an hour when she asked him to leave. He asked for some photos and paperwork, and she refused. A pushing match ensued, and her dog jumped up and bit him on the cheek, Zazu claimed. Zimmerman, in a petition filed the next day, painted her as the aggressor, wanting him to stay the night. And so for me, this is actually a blueprint for the argument that he would later make about Trayvon Martin, trolling someone in the neighborhood, that person was the aggressor, not George Zimmerman, and that he actually gets away with it. And so part of what I want to argue with George Zimmerman and with these next 2 cases as well is that we can see a pattern of violence in George Zimmerman's past, and we can also see that the testing ground for that violence were girls and women. But oftentimes our response, or at least the mainstream media's response, is not necessarily to connect the dots between those former acts of violence and these later acts of violence. And I feel like it's important for us to think about them as a part of a continuum of violence, but also to give a primacy to violence against girls and women. Not only because it's important that we do so, but also if we are thinking about a safe and just culture, that girls and women's bodies are not only the testing ground, but they're also the people who are most vulnerable to forms of violence, but also they're the ones whose forms of justice continuously go unchecked and unnoticed, right? Okay, and so obviously African-American boys like Trayvon Martin fit into that category, but I'm gonna argue that, that there's a hierarchy of violence that we live in, and that people start practicing those forms of violence oftentimes in the home and and against people that they are first connected to or know well, and then perpetrate those forms of violence against strangers, as in George Zimmerman's case with Trayvon Martin. So we're all familiar with the Boston Marathon bombing. This occurred last April, and part of the story that we understood was that this was an act of terrorism, right? That's the mainstream media characterization of this. And we can argue if that's the right word, but we do know that Tamerlan Tsarnaev, along with his brother, we don't know this, but this is what the allegations are, and Dzhokhar were accused of using 2 explosive pressure cookers last April during the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring an estimated 264. What was less known is this was a small part in a larger profile of Tamerlan in the New York Times. The previous summer, Mr. Tsarnaev had been arrested after a report of domestic violence. His girlfriend had called 911, hysterically crying, to say he'd beaten her up, according to the Cambridge police report. Mr. Tsarnaev told the officers that he had slapped her in the face because she had been yelling at him about another girl. Eventually, charges against him would be dismissed. the records show, so the episode would not have endangered his eventual citizenship application. So the piece in many ways is about an aggravated person who doesn't get US citizenship and then becomes radicalized and then leads to the Boston Marathon bombing. That's how the piece is framed. And now, if you're following this case at all, there's evidence that he participated in a murder a year after this, but also a year before the Boston bombing. But that instance of violence is given primacy, whereas this earlier incident, and then also his relationship with his wife, is often characterized as very controlling and domineering and may have been violent, is kind of not talked about as much as maybe even his ability to box, right? So there are ways in which other stories get sidelined for these bigger narratives. And this case is less a case, I think, it's not a case about violence against girls and women in the traditional sense, but if we think about Jared Lee Loughner's, the media coverage of what set him off, what changed in him. And so a lot of the characterization was about him as mentally ill, but there was a very little discussion of the role sexism may have played in the deterioration of Jared Lee Loughner. So 2 stories, one on ABC News and it's another one from the New York Times, pointed out, but they don't really know what to do with the story. A girl had written a poem about abortion. It was very emotional, and she was teary-eyed, and he had said something about strapping a bomb to the fetus and making a baby bomber. And this is what a friend of his said. The next one, as he alienated from his small clutch of friends, grew contemptuous of women in positions of power, and became increasingly oblivious to basic social mores. He seemed to be part of a dreamy alternate world where the sky was sometimes orange, the grass sometimes blue, and the internet informational chaos provided refuge. I can't really see that one as well. Sorry about the misreading. And so here we have another case where it's not, he eventually committed acts of violence against men and women, shooting 19 people, including Gabby Giffords, and then which 6 people died, one of which was 9-year-old Christina Taylor Greene. But the media response simply put Jared Lee Loughner in this aberrant position. He was mentally ill, whereas someone like Ariel Castro is monstrous, whereas Sarnoff is terroristic. Little emphasis was placed in the larger pattern emerging, that women's bodies are often the testing ground and battleground for the other acts of violence these men later commit. And once those later forms of violence become known, the media and law officials, they still go on a relentless search for the reasons why such acts occur. Very rarely were their previous aggressions or violent acts against women seen as predictors or the root cause of their crimes. But what we do know, and this is research recently done by Valerie Hudson and others in Sex and World Peace, and they aggregated data from women's stats that looked at 265 countries. And so their argument is this, that feminists have been arguing in this for years, so it's not really new, that nation states are mirrored off of patriarchal family structures, that gender difference becomes our first moment of understanding social hierarchies and other forms of difference, and that violence against women is one of the most important indicators of how likely society is to go to war or be in a state of peace. And my argument to this is that violence against women leads to more violence, right? And just in case you're interested in how the US does on the scale of physical security of women, with 0 being the best case scenario and 5 being the worst case scenario, no country in the world received a 0. No country in the world is great in terms of physical security of women. The United States is right in the middle. For instance, it scores 2 on this scale because even if it has good laws compared to other countries, the relative prevalence of domestic violence and rape in this country skews the United States and Canada to number 2. And I would argue that those of us who work with the most vulnerable populations in the United States, women of color, queer women, and working class women, the scoring actually would be much worse if we use an intersectional analysis. The other thing I want to say about this is if we take violence against girls and women seriously, and we understand it to be an indicator of both peace and war, how would it shape our understanding of national security? What would that conversation that we're currently having about reforming military sexual assault codes that actually is being debated in Congress right now, what would that conversation look like? Would it be something that people would actually take even more seriously and create political will if we understood this to be the root of violence as opposed to maybe an aberration of violence or maybe something that happens when you close the doors?
Okay, so with this panel, we are especially interested in exploring the role of the media in both challenging and contributing to a culture of violence against women. We have a great lineup here with us. So we have Salamisha. Right next to Salamisha is Sharmili Majmudar, who is, you guys have bios in front of you, so I'll just quickly go through who folks are. Sharmili is the executive director of Rape Victims Advocate. And then we have Claudia Garcia Rojas, who is the editor and one of the co-authors of a toolkit reporting on rape and sexual violence. She's also a graduate student at Northwestern. Natalie Moore with WBEZ, reporter with WBEZ. And then Jae-Jin Pak, who is a male ally in this world of sexual violence against women, who works towards that and also is at UIC. And then Beth Ritchie, who's the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. Yeah. So, right? I know, I can't get that one right. She's also, her most recent book is called Arrested Justice: Black Women, Violence, in America's Prison Nation. So I also want to invite all of you to join the conversation by live tweeting using the hashtag #MediaRemix. So the live tweets are going to be on that screen, so you can take a look at that and contribute to the conversation that way as well. So, yeah, so if you see people on their phone up here, that's probably why. Or they're multitasking. So, okay. So given this focus on the role of the media, I actually wanted to start with Natalie, and I wanted to ask Natalie to talk about her experience as a journalist and the challenges that you faced covering and reporting on violence against women.
Good evening, everyone. I think journalists need tools, and journalists need to be called out. And I know Claudia will talk some more about her toolkit that they gave. I think most journalists don't think they're doing anything wrong. When we see mistakes in the press, I personally don't think that there's just ill will behind the intent. The behavior ends up being ill will. But I don't think that these are conversations that are happening in newsrooms. But I think that the culture of a newsroom can change. You know, I think in the 70s, it's not a formal policy, and it's not illegal to name a rape victim or rape survivor, but the general rule is that you don't name those people. And that's just kind of a culture. I mean, the change happened before I became a journalist, but that's just sort of accepted. And is now a good time to talk about my own little journey, or do you want me to save that for later?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have made mistakes that I am happy to talk about. Last month, I went to a seminar sponsored by the McCormick Foundation at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. There were about 15 journalists around the country who applied and went to the session on how journalists can better cover sex trafficking. And there were mistakes that I had made that no one had called me out on. And, you know, mistakes are also, someone might not think what I did was a mistake. And I consider myself to be a thoughtful journalist who listens to people. But one thing that we all agreed on is that we would never use the word child prostitute, even if police use it. You know, some of the conflict that journalists have, or if we're repeating what law enforcement is saying, and if their language hasn't changed, then it's really going to be hard for journalists to change their language. So no child can make this choice to be a prostitute, so we all walked away with that pledge. But I've used the term prostitute as a noun. I've used the word sex worker, trying to, and I think sometimes I'm trying to please different groups and I'm using the wrong term. Journalists should always ask people how they want to be identified. We are seeing a shift, I think, in survivor being a term versus victim. But, you know, prostitution, that is how it's characterized by the Chicago Police Department. So our this is just one aspect of gender-based violence. So is it wrong to use the word prostitution when that is the legal term? So, and then also, if we're saying a child can't be a prostitute, but most women who are trafficked become trafficked when they are teenagers and when they're young. So when they turn 21 or 19, are they magically no longer trafficked? So these conversations made me think really hard. I think toolkits, I think calling journalists out on social media or even just calling them on the phone. I get that all the time. Someone will say, well, you really shouldn't use, just this week, you shouldn't use the term heroin overdose because you're saying that there is a good dose to take. Just say heroin death. And, I think that sometimes sometimes the public may want to bully journalists because we think that's so egregious. How could they say that? But I think having activist movements be kind to journalists and instructive rather than just simply, bullying on Twitter or, making assumptions when it could have been, like, no one's having those conversations. And so I think the activists can be the launching pad for pushing the conversation in newsrooms. And then I can say, hey, guess what I learned? Or, hey, have you all seen this toolkit? And that's how I think the culture in newsrooms will start to change.
Great. So, yeah, I want to take it immediately, I think, to Claudia then, because Claudia did co-author. It was a 45-page toolkit called Reporting on Rape and Sexual Violence, a media toolkit for local and national journalists to better media coverage. So I want to ask you, how do we actually push this conversation and hold the media more accountable and hold each other more accountable?
So I think that there are several ways in which we could hold the media accountable. I'm not going to go through an in-depth analysis of everything that's in the toolkit, but if you go to www.shytaskforce.org, you can download the toolkit and sort of see all of the things that we've detailed on there. But the first thing that I want to say is that I think we could trouble our notion of consent. I think that our term consent is very much associated to sexual violence, and we don't see it as an everyday practice. We don't see it as something that we're constantly engaging in. So for those of us that are fans of Scandal, I would ask you to maybe sort of observe the relationship between Olivia Pope and Fitz and sort of see how consent plays out there when she's constantly sort of saying no and he's pressuring her. But we could also just think about it in terms of, if you want to go to the movies and someone's trying to pressure you to go do something else, right? There's a level of consent in that we don't often look at. And so if we think of consent as an everyday practice, I think that kind of troubles our understanding of how we look at it when we think of it in terms of sexual violence. The second thing that I want to say is that I think we also need to trouble our notion of rape culture. I think that this has become a very habitual term that we use, but we actually don't understand what we mean by it. So what I want to ask all of you to do for a few seconds is to just, what does rape culture mean to you? Just think about that for a few seconds, and then I'm going to read a definition to you. So if you've jotted down how it is that you define rape culture. This is the definition that we include in the toolkit, and I think it's an excellent definition. And so rape culture refers neither to physical locations where rape is deemed likely to occur, does not occur, and or has occurred, nor the specific details of particular rapes. Rather, it refers to a culture, that is a set of values, beliefs, rituals, social codes, languages, laws, and art, which can be said to promote sexual violence, and particularly sexual violence against women, as perpetrated by straight men. Note that this argument neither automatically nor universally implies the existence of a direct causal link between specific cultural artifacts and incidences of rape, though it certainly is possible, nor does it contend that every participant in that culture is or must be a rapist. What it does describe is a culture where rape is trivialized, where both the abuse and sexual objectification of women is normalized, and where, as a result, the sexual abuse of women is more likely to happen. So I think that really breaks down what rape culture is. I know that was sort of a lot, so again, you could go to the website and look at that definition when you have time. because I think it really breaks it down nicely. And then the last thing that I'm going to say is that I think that we need to sort of consider the ways in which violence against girls and young women is intersectional, and as a result, they are more vulnerable. So what do I mean by intersectional? I mean that in addition to the physical violence that we might endure, there's also verbal violence, there's also racism, there's also transphobia, there's homophobia. So there are all these other sort of dynamics that we sort of walk through in our day-to-day life that sort of get interlaced with the violence that we may endure by a perpetrator or just structurally. So I would say that those are the three things that we try and highlight in the toolkit, but also that we would like media to acknowledge.
Okay, just before we move on, I just want to ask you to maybe unpack a little bit more what we mean by rape culture when we talk about rape culture. I think that one aspect of rape culture, and especially as we see it in the media, is that, and I think that you talk about this in the toolkit, that there's a tendency for the media to have a bias that blames the victim. And I think that that's very much a part of rape culture as well. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think there's this journalist, her name is Tara Murtha, and I really like, she has this article that she wrote, and what I really like that she says in it is that media is written from the perspective, sorry, I have to look at this again. It's written from the perspective of a white male perpetrator. And I think that even though this might sound biased to some, I think that what is really good about what she's doing with this definition, or this sort of how she's sort of alluding to the way rape culture plays out through the media, is that she's sort of establishing what the norm is within media establishments, which is the majority of the people writing and the majority of the people that are employed are white men. So that's not to say that all white men are rapists, but that is to say that there is a culture that's been established, that's heterosexual, that's primarily white, and also that sort of pushes violence forward, right, within whatever this knowledge is that has been sort of established, right? So to sort of be more concrete about that, I think that there's a tendency to normalize violence against women, making it permissible, so that whenever we do challenge those norms, we get a lot of pushback, as though we're the ones that are approaching it with some sort of like idea that's like radical, when it's actually not. I don't know if that was clear, but I think.
I guess I just want to add, in the case that in Maryville, where there was a young girl who sexually assaulted, came forward after, she came forward eventually. It's also like not just blaming the individual victim, but then her brother was terrorized in the school, the mother was fired from her job, and then we're not sure what happened, but their house eventually was burned down too, right? So that rape culture or victim blaming isn't only, and the girl tried to commit suicide too, so right, so that there's all these ripple effects of that initial victim blaming that kind of keeps on going and going. And so part of what I'm thinking about is like, how do these acts of gender-based violence, like how are they forms of domestic terrorism? Like how do we go from domestic violence to and thinking about it in that way as well? So that's just my quick point to add to your wonderful point there. So.
Thanks. Can we turn up the volume at all for these speakers? Okay, thanks. Okay. Actually, I wanted to move on to Sharmili, and on Rape Victim Advocates website, you guys actually list out a bunch of myths, prevailing myths that are ongoing. And I think, victim blaming is one aspect of rape culture, but I think that we still have prevailing myths around violence against women. And if you could say a little bit about what some of those myths continue to be.
Well, I think that this aspect of victim blaming actually is very central to the myths, right? That a lot of myths about sexual violence. Thank you. A lot of myths about sexual violence actually serve to dismiss, minimize, and contradict the existence of violence against women and girls, the experience of violence against women and girls, just the lived reality of so many people. So I think in essence, almost all myths are victim blaming, right? But you know, I think that a lot of people are very familiar with some myths, right? The idea that what a woman is wearing somehow causes sexual violence or provokes sexual violence might be one of them. Another myth is that sexual violence is only an issue for young, straight, white, heterosexual women. Another common myth is that it's primarily perpetrated by strangers when someone is jogging or drunk and walking by an alley. I think of all the myths, actually, that we really need to strive to undo. That one is particularly dangerous because so much then of the media attention or kind of the common ideas of violence prevention then get directed towards this idea of controlling women's bodies in public spaces, right? So the way to avoid being raped is to not be alone out at night and to not drink and to not, it's all about controlling the behavior of women. And it also leaves us very kind of blind and unequipped to deal with the reality that it's actually people who are within our intimate spheres and intimate relationships who are the ones who are often perpetrating the most harm, whether we're talking about sexual violence, domestic violence, et cetera. And I think what that myth does is very layered. So it leads to these very public messages that basically say that women are in charge of making sure that they don't get raped, right? It also leads to very public messages suggesting that if women don't do the 10 things on the good girl checklist, that they in some way were accountable for the fact that they were sexually assaulted. It also completely denies that anyone who is in a relationship in which those strategies would not be applicable could have been sexually assaulted, right? So it erases the idea of sexual violence as being something that could even happen within a relationship or within a place of trust. So, you know, I think that one has many layers to it that become very problematic when we're talking about sexual violence. So those are a few.
So what many of us have come to understand is that the violence that women experience is shaped by multiple factors, and Claudia touched on this, you know, that violence against women is intersectional. Can you tell us, unpack that a little bit more for us? What does it mean to have an intersectional analysis of violence against women, and why is it important to have that kind of analysis?
Well, I think violence against women is intersectional in a myriad number of ways. So to give just a few examples of that, one of which is, and Salamisha touched on this, the idea of sexual assault within the military, which has received a great deal of public attention, hearings on the Hill, there's pending legislation. A lot of that has really focused on the idea of sexual assault that's perpetrated by members of the military against other members of the military. The public discourse around it has really focused on women being survivors of sexual violence that's perpetrated by men within the military. There's been an erasure of the experience of men who have experienced sexual violence at the hands of other men within the military. And how that violence gets perpetrated as a way of reinforcing hierarchy and power within the military. So there's that. But then the other piece that we don't talk about in all of these hearings and in all of this legislation and all of this conversation is the sexual violence that's actually perpetrated by the US military in other places against people of other countries where there are bases, such as the Philippines, such as Japan, you know, many other places, and how that's been perpetrated over years years and years and years. And that's not, it's curious to me that we're talking about military sexual assault, but we don't talk about that, right? Is that not military sexual assault? And kind of a corollary to that is this idea that sexual assault gets used as this pretext for us to invade countries, right? It's because we're going to go save those poor brown women over there whose own countries are not kind of protecting them. And so, that's a fundamental contradiction to me, right? That the idea that we're going over there to protect women, that's the pretext for US foreign policy and imperialism. And so there's that kind of intersection of the issue. I think sexual violence being used as a tool of gender policing overall also. And you can see that in cases where you have women of color, lesbian women of color who are incarcerated because they fought back against someone who was perpetrating violence against them that was sexualized. Here in the US, you've heard about corrective rape as a way of addressing sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression. So there's another kind of intersection there. And then also the fact that undocumented migrant and farm workers are especially vulnerable to sexual violence. So if you have a country in which we have anti-immigrant policy and anti-immigrant sentiment, that there is a direct connection between that and the fact that there is a whole class of people who are completely disenfranchised as a result. And the sexual violence that's committed against them, they have very, very little recourse against that without completely losing their livelihood, being deported, et cetera, so.
Great, thanks. So building on this idea of intersectionality, I think I want to ask Beth, because in your book, you really make the case that, making connections is really important for us in terms of looking at the violence against women that Black women in particular experience, and also this building of a prison nation that we've also seen. So can you talk a little bit about the connections between the experiences of Black women facing violence and this increased criminalization of Black and brown bodies that we've seen?
Well, thanks for the question, Alice, because it really does build right on what Sharmili was talking about, in the sense that when I think about rape culture, I think not only about rape, but policy, and the ways that the US government and other governments have organized themselves to arbitrarily use power and coerce people into behavior that they think is better for that government, and especially better for elite people in that government. And when people don't comply to that, they use violence to control them. And that's what prisons do, that's what the military does, that's increasingly what schools do, that's what happens in families, that's what happens when women are assaulted because of football teams, so that in some ways there's the notion of rape sort of more metaphorically, to me, a rape culture more metaphorically, to me, is the arbitrary use of power to control people by people who have power and then blaming them for what happens to them. And so in some ways, Sharmili's examples are exactly the examples, but in different contexts, that I would use to talk about what happens to African American and Black women within the context of a prison nation, not only Black women, but in particular Black women. And it prompts me to sort of say that in our discussions so far, we haven't, we've of course talked about the solutions about building movements, but we haven't talked about the more common solution that we turn to in the problem of rape and sexual violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence, violence against trans people, is to turn to that system that is part of rape culture to solve the problem. and the ways that we try to legislate the problem away or use laws to criminalize the problem, when in fact it is the state that in fact is the foundation of the problem. So, thank you, sister. But it is, in fact, that we often even talk about the critique of the cases of who didn't get prosecuted, who didn't get arrested, that law enforcement didn't respond. And in many ways, that is sort of the first thing that the media, I mean, a progressive media would say. And we would appreciate when a media says that the legal system failed this woman. But it's a question for me about how, when the legal system fails, is that the only thing that we're looking for, is a legal and legislative response to these problems? We've got to build movements, but we've also got to realize that laws and passing legislation, whether it's mandatory arrest, whether it's protecting victims' rights, whether it's pro-prosecution, those things don't end rape culture. They're part of the culture. They reinforce a culture of rape because they use a tool that arbitrarily disadvantages certain people to solve a problem that is about disadvantaging certain people through the use of power. And it's a complicated one. I mean, I don't necessarily have all of the answers. I don't even have some of the answers, but I do think we have to be careful not to only ask the media not to blame victims, but also to not advance an analysis of the problem that would rely on law enforcement only.
So just to follow up on that, if we're looking in the wrong place, if looking at the criminal legal system is looking at the wrong place, then where else should we be looking?
Well, I think the discussion about intersectionality offers us some opportunity. I mean, people are hurt, they're raped, and they're battered, and they're overly incarcerated, and they're thrown out of schools, and otherwise mistreated because we've divested from communities. And we've left people vulnerable because of an economic system and a political system that says some bodies, some people, some groups aren't as valued as others. And that's why people are raped, that's why schools close, that's why communities don't have enough food. And I think we have to reinvest in communities. And I don't think that we're going to solve the problem of gender violence only by looking at those other issues, but I certainly think by reinvesting in communities, including investing in the safety and opportunities for women and girls, will go a long way toward decreasing rape. And a culture that invests in communities is one that minimizes rape culture and gives communities power instead of the state power to try to solve the problem.
All right, thanks, Beth. So I want to turn to the role of men in stopping violence against women. You know, I'm looking around this room and I'm seeing that it is overwhelmingly female, but I think that we would probably all agree that, you know, men have an important role to play in ending violence against women. So I want to ask Jae-Jin, you know, to speak to that. And in particular, we had talked previously about, and maybe other people have seen this too, that there was the Patrick Stewart video that went viral earlier this year. I think it was around the springtime, where he, you know, spoke very powerfully to the role of men in stopping violence against women, and sort of very simply suggested or asserted or declared that that it was really in men's hands to stop violence towards women, because since men, in terms of male violence against women, men are the perpetrators. So sort of simply declared that. And I wanted to ask Jae-Jin to, you know, what does he make of that statement, and, you know, what does it mean to be a male ally, if that's even the correct term to be using?
Hi, everybody. I'm very grateful, and I do feel very, very honored to be included on this panel with amazing leaders who happen to be women, and who I would follow any day of the week, and because of their brilliance and their insights. I am not here to speak on behalf of men. I will not do that. Please do not expect that from me. It is a little unnerving being the only man up here. And I say that because this is a man's issue. Men need to be part of it. It is in men's hands. I do agree with that statement. The vast majority of violence that happens to women, sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, domestic violence, other forms of harassment, bullying, is done by men, by males. When we talk, when I spent about over 20 years in domestic violence and sexual assault work. I spent 10 years doing direct service of advocacy and counseling, and I spent about 10, 12 years doing prevention. And as I was doing prevention and workshops for young adults and professionals, I came to realize that, we spend a lot of time putting the burden on prevention on women. Do this, do this, do this, you'll stay safe. There was very little, and I fell into that trap. The reality is if you want to do prevention, you have to focus and start talking to the potential perpetrators, which are men and boys. I grew up in a society, I grew up, I'm Korean by birth, and I came over as a child, and I was socialized in American culture. And I was taught that masculinity in this culture and the culture in socialization culture that I was raised, men are tough, they're not emotional, and women are for men's pleasure. That is the message that I got, and that's the messages I've seen in media. I thank the powers above that I instinctively knew not to pursue that and not to hurt anybody. I will also be the very first to say I have done sexist things because that is what I was taught. In what I have learned over the years with amazing teachers, both male and female, has encouraged me to question the lessons I have heard, that I have learned. Everything from bedtime stories to the heroes that I looked up to, whether they're fictional like Superman or real life examples as leaders. And to really think about, okay, if I want to be a good man, if you really, as men, if we really like the idea of being a good man, what does that, really think? What does that mean? Does that mean being tough and pursuing that image of the tough, solitary, stoic, always leader kind of guy who everyone somewhat fears? Or is it to value yourself as a person and view the women and girls in your lives as people, that there are partnerships, that if the woman who is your sister, mother, aunt, boss, friend, if they have a good idea, then follow. It is not unmanly to follow a woman as a leader. I've had amazing mentors who are women. I've had amazing bosses who are women. And I've had some stupid bosses that are men. It's in the idea of rape culture and masculinity, we as men and boys have been so fed, spoon-fed, this consistent garbage of you have to be tough, you have to do things, you have to pursue women. If you're gay, there's no room for you. And that's not fair either. And that's closing off and turning away from a lot of amazing men who have gifts and information and a lot of friendships to offer that are possible as well.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess
think that-
in short, I'll wrap up because I know I can go on. In terms of male allies, there is this simple of question what we've been taught and step back and just, if you see things that are sexist, comments, jokes, tweets, blog posts, do something simple and just unlike it, or say that's not funny, or I don't like that. And it's simple, it's not grandiose, it's not like overpowering, but it's a message. And if you keep saying that, it will get heard by people, and people will start to think about it. And thanks.
So I think Jae-Jin touched on a couple of important things. One, that we need to change what our notions of masculinity are. And I think in order to do that we have to find and create more opportunities for dialogue about these kinds of things, whether it comes to, what is heteronormative and what are gender roles that we are still, that still impact us every day, to what is, violence against women look like. It was interesting to me also that you kind of touched on sort of blog posts, tweeting, so on and so forth, because I feel like in this day and age, because of, the prevalent and widespread use of social media, it has actually, on the one hand, made it more possible to have these conversations, and then on the other hand, you also see, I think, the dangerous uses of social media, in particular in this context, in fostering a rape culture. So I actually wanted to take it back to Natalie and Salamisha to talk to us a little bit about, how this new social media culture has impacted rape culture.
I'll just give one example. I think the way I found out about, I forgot what magazine it was, but there was a story done about Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and they interviewed, it was 2 white men who did the story. And like in the first few graphs, they described his accuser as having a pockmarked face. So like, one, what did her appearance have to do with anything? But they were painting her kind of like, why would he want to rape her anyway? She's an unattractive immigrant. So I found, I wasn't covering that story, but that spread on social media. And so I think that, I just think even now, like what the audience is doing, Media Remix, that can, people can click on that and they can see some of this conversation. But I think, praising people when they do well, but also saying this is wrong and then starting a conversation. Again, not to try to, in that case, those writers definitely needed to be shamed, but, shaming the institution. Why did this happen? Why did you let that get out? And I think media outlets now have to respond a little bit more with social media, because otherwise you might have written a letter to the editor or maybe made some phone calls. But Salamisha gave the examples too, where the public editor of the New York Times had to give an apology on the story that was referenced about the girl who was gang raped in Cleveland, Texas. That spread. And so I think when you get those conversations out there, you get response, and then you pressure and that was a great case where you have the public editor writing a column and saying this was wrong. I think that those are ways of democratizing media, that you just don't have to rely on mainstream media. And obviously there are lots of other, progressive media outlets that can maybe take more of a stand on issues, but the PSAs that were even shown, I think there are just so many more ways to get the message out there, and it doesn't just rely on the hegemonic forces that we once had of just 3 news channels and just one newspaper in your city where that's where you're getting your news and information from.
So I guess I wrote a piece this summer about technology being like a double-edged sword. So on one hand, especially for young people in high schools. It's a space, social media sites are spaces of slut shaming, of victim blaming. And there are a number of cases this year, one in California, one in Vancouver, and then were two girls who claimed to be sexually assaulted later committed suicide because of the intense onslaught of attacks that they were experiencing on social media sites, right? And then there's another case in Connecticut too. So I think there's a way in which social media has, part of the democratization means a kind of opening up of activism, but it also means a democratization of violence too. I think that's happening sometimes with social media sites. The other thing I think is really interesting though is I think another thing I wrote, because I said there's every day there's a new thing to write about, is the emergence of apps globally and domestically that can help, and mapping, right? And what was really interesting about in Egypt with the protests this summer is that I interviewed one of the founders of an organization there, and if you could text them when you were sexually assaulted, and then they would send in people to Tahrir Square and help you. So there's a way in which technology, there's a kind of rapid response in certain countries around ending violence against girls and women. So there's good and bad. And it's also a site of evidence, right? Like that in Steubenville, or even in Cleveland, Texas, the case that I talked about, one of the ways in which the prosecutor is able to get evidence is because the same tools that are used for victim shaming, i.e. a viral video, can also be used for evidence. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which I think social media and technology are used for good and for evil right now. And I think it's up to us to figure out where, what that tipping point really is going to look like and what that means. So that's my spiel on new technologies and old violence. Yeah.
So I have lots of more questions that I could ask Salamisha or anybody on this panel, but I did want to give all of you the opportunity to ask questions, also share any insights or thoughts that you might have. So we'll go ahead and open it up to all of you right now. Yes.
In order to interrupt the culture of violence, is it better to approach it as one rape culture, one culture of violence, or based on all the examples we gave, you can look at 6, 7, 8 different kinds of cultures of violence, different kinds of rape cultures. In order to interrupt it, is it better to have one approach, or is it many different approaches?
So just to repeat the question, I think that what you're asking is, do we need to have multiple approaches to interrupting a culture of violence or rape culture, or is there sort of one broad stroke that we can apply?
Oh, okay, I'll answer. I'm sure anyone here can answer that question, so please jump in. I mean, I think it's both and, which is a very academic response. I think that when Sharmila and Beth were talking about intersectionality, that's kind of what I was trying to do with those cases. Like, if we actually thought about how all of these things come together, we would understand what we consider larger forms of violence, even though I consider violence against girls and women to be equal to that. We would consider these other forms of violence differently. And we would also have a different response, a prevention response. And I think this is kind of what Beth is talking about too. Like, not only do we have to change our punitive measures, but how do we really engage in prevention? So I think it's, the first thing I do is say, take violence against girls and women as the center of these violences. That's what I'm asking. So in that sense, maybe there's a center to the analysis, but then how we confront it and how we deal with it and how to prevent it is going to require a multi-platform response, right? And that includes, direct services. It includes retraining media, teachers, and everyone. It just requires all these different things. So I don't know if you all want to add to that as well.
One of the mistakes that we've made is to act as if different kinds of violence are different, and almost act as if, and then also prioritize that some violence is worse than other kinds of violence. And I think in Chicago, one of the things we haven't done very well is talk about youth violence as if girls are also youth, right? That's sort of been framed as a young male problem, particularly African-American male. And then we talk about sexual assault as if that only happens to girls. And so I think we've made the mistake of trying to sort of categorically respond almost in some kind of population-defined way, as opposed to taking a more systemic holistic understanding of what violence is and drawing the kinds of links that Salamisha referred to.
Can I just add to that, because this is from like a slight outsider perspective, but one of the things I didn't talk about in my talk was the way in which quote-unquote gang violence is predicated on violence against girls and women, right? So for initiations, right, there's oftentimes multiple offenders who attack a young girl. It's also a way of initiating boys into this hyper-masculinist culture, and then boys are also sexually assaulted as part of grooming. So so the gang violence stories that we tell, whether it's in Chicago or nationally, don't include these forms of violence, but my argument again is that this violence is needed in order for those other forms of violences to reproduce themselves and to really devastate communities.
And if I can, I think it's also important when we talk about violence that we start intentionally framing and defining rape as violence, sexual assault as violence. For a long time, there's been underlying messages or underlying intonations that rape is just bad sex, and that is wrong. That's just wrong. If there's force involved, there's no consent, it is violent. It causes harm to somebody, just like a physical attack, just like any kind of other form of verbal violence or physical violence, it is violent. And I think if we start to move and talking amongst ourselves and moving toward a movement or a change to start seeing sexual assault as violence, then it might move toward steps to really start seeing it that way and not as some kind of weird sexual thing, and not get hung up on that.
Sharmila.
I think to build off of that too, I think one of the things that happens, and Beth really spoke to this, is that our conversations then, in an effort to address rape culture, for example, our conversations then immediately go to what's legal and what's not legal, right? And so it almost becomes about like, how far can I go before I'm now committing a crime? There's a lot of reasons that framing is problematic, but I think one of them is what it leaves out is the idea of ethical behavior, right? What is ethical? How do we ethically relate to one another? How do we ethically engage in intimacy with one another? And so kind of pushing us to not simply rely on the language of criminal justice, and the language of what is legal and what's not legal, but really getting into that not being the only way that we decide what's wrong, right? So whether or not something is illegal is not the only way in which we think about what is wrong. Thinking about how we are relating to each other ethically is more how we, in an everyday way, think about someone's behavior, someone's actions, someone's words being wrong. And I think that's a really important frame for us to use for sexual violence. And as just one kind of example, just an example related to the criminal justice system and some of what Jay was talking about is that these issues of kind of gender roles and how we are acculturated as it relates to masculinity and the role of women, all of those things, these are not just like conceptual issues. These are issues that have a very real impact on the lived experiences of all of us. And one of those impacts, for example, is that jurors who have more traditional, more binary ideas of gender roles are less likely to believe victims. Okay? So even if we're not, even if we're just talking about criminal justice, to kind of flip on the other side, these ideas of gender roles have like a very real impact on the lives of survivors, on the lives of people who commit harm, and on the lives of all of us. It's not just a ideological idea.
Okay.
I've been wondering if someone could comment a little bit about the intersectionality with poverty. It's clear that it's disproportionately but I wonder where some of the oppression, the fact that, like, in our nation, among others, that we don't like to talk about really raising up the voices and the realities of people. We like to victimize people who don't have sufficient resources. And I'm wondering if somebody could talk about that little intersectionality right there, or large intersection.
Okay, so the question is about the relationship between gender-based violence and class and poverty.
Well, this will be just one part of it, but it's in at least the frame that I used to think about this. So violence is a form of, poverty is a form of violence, not only in the kind of, again, metaphorical sense, but also the way that we criminalize poor people and the ways that places like welfare offices are increasingly under the control of the state, and there are a whole new set of laws related to welfare fraud, so that we blame people for being poor, and then we criminalize them for trying to survive because we've made them poor and kept them poor. So again, I think, and that's part of rape culture. That's part of a culture that says, the state will determine how, first of all, who's to blame for what happened to you, and then we will criminalize those who can't survive or can't resist or can't fight back, to use sort of what we think about in terms of sexual assault work, who can't resist the assault of poverty. We will criminalize them instead of holding accountable the state that has created poverty. And it's not, I mean, I'm not just talking in kind of abstract terms. Just like schools now are places where people are under surveillance in a very different kind of way, kids are, welfare offices are places where people are increasingly under surveillance, where there's security not just to keep people safe, but security to monitor people's behavior. And, you know, I could go on and on about the length of time that people serve now as opposed to at previous points in our history for this very same violations of selling food stamps, for example. So I think poverty fits into the broader analysis of rape culture in that it's, again, the state controlling people through its arbitrary use of authority for people for whom the violence was created by the state in the first place. Now, there's also, I think, a more concrete answer that I could go on, but someone else could jump in too, that people who have less economic resources suffer more when they're harmed. They may experience more violence, but they certainly suffer more because they have fewer resources to respond to the violence in the first place. And when they come to the attention of service agencies, again, they're more likely to be treated disrespectfully at best, but then blamed for the experience of violence that they experienced. I don't know if any.
You touched on this too, with like the investing in the communities narrative that you were.
Right, right. And places like shelters for homeless women are places that are full of battered women and sexual assault survivors. And they're also hurt by the people who run those programs sometimes. I'm not speaking about individual programs, but those are sites where the state or the agency or the institution has arbitrary control of power over people who need something from that institution, and so they therefore have the ability to abuse that power, and they do. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
Okay, I saw a question back there.
I have a quick comment about social media and then a question about vocabulary and language. I've been an advocate in the area largely of sexual assault, generally gender violence, for about 30 years. And I have to say, one thing that I've noticed through my use and my experience with social media is I am getting to see in real time the change in attitudes. And I'm seeing, in particular, men saying things that I could not have dreamed of 25 years ago or 30 years ago. And that ability to be exposed to that gives me breathing space in my activism and my advocacy. And I think I'm not the only one. And I think that we also get to project each other. And there's that 25, 30 years ago, the line "you are not alone" was really important. And I think it's a lot easier for people to discover that. So I'm just throwing that.
Can you just give a couple examples of the kinds of statements that you've heard that?
Well, I mean, I immediately
I'm sorry, what was that?
Human rights. That these are not special rights, they're not, this is not a niche issue, these are human rights. And I just wonder how you guys feel about, the panel feels about the use of that terminology, because that's terminology to which people have access already. How does the term human rights work for you guys?
Okay, so the question is, how do we go beyond, how do we reach out to people beyond the choir, I guess is a question, and how do we be thoughtful and think about the use of language in doing that, and do we want to adopt a human rights framework to talk about sexual violence?
Well, the human rights framework, as you're doing, is being adopted. I think a lot of feminist scholars, I think one of our board members, Regine Jean-Charles, a lot of the current human rights discourse actually is still very sexist and doesn't include this, right? So that's part of that book, Sex and World Peace, is that it's trying to change how we think about foreign policy and how we're trying to think about the human rights discourse. So it's a useful term, but it also has a lot of gender bias built into it based on how we've currently used it. So I think it's both
Go through and then say, no, but look, we're people too. So you have this idea about what humans are. Hey, guess what? The other 50% of humanity is my thought. Go on.
No, and I think it's effective. I wonder though if the panelists, we could talk about, when it comes to like communities of color, like, and even my own individual work, I don't know if that's the best framework to like the human rights discourse. I mean, I think there's an assumption that we're human beings, but for me, I think one of my strategies, and I'm very open to being pushed on this, is that I think everyone's so impacted by violence against girls and women that if we can just clearly state that as truth and as fact, then we're going to also open the conversation. Like, part of our board strategies is to have 60% women, 40% men, but a lot of the men who are involved in our organization either grew up in households with domestic violence or are sexual assault victims themselves or are partners to someone who's experienced gender-based violence. So it's such a universal issue already that I think for me it's about showing it as such, as opposed to only using another language to get people on board. But I do think it's a useful framework.
I would say as a writer, I could never probably get away with using the word intersectionality in my copy because it's, we're talking like high ideas right now with some of our word choice, and it's a little academic. So if you're trying to reach masses, maybe I can quote Salamisha, framing it all nicely and putting it together, but there's also an expression in journalism, writing in general, show, don't tell. Don't tell me it's cold outside. Write that someone's standing on the bus stop and their nose is running and you can see their breath and they're shivering. That's more powerful. So I cover a lot of violence issues. I don't cover violence in Chicago. I don't cover who got shot last night. I cover issues in communities. So when you talked about poverty, like that's what I am always saying. We look at the most violent communities as an example. They have the highest unemployment. They have high poverty. So I think just being, you can quote the people who use the high language, but when you're writing for a general audience, you're just going to have to show, don't tell, make the connections, and just use very plain language. That's not dumbing down, but this rape culture isn't quite yet a mainstream term. I think for some of us in this room, we use it and we may think that it's used more than what it actually is. And it may get to that point where it is part of mainstream culture as a phrase, but I don't think that we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Jenny and then Nicole, but I did want to say that part of using, I think, a term like rape culture, though, is to provoke a reaction and to, basically assert that this may exist, and for people then to ask, well, what do you mean by that? And I think that there is, in terms of using language, and also it was language that was, someone came up with it, right? So it was injected into our language, I think, in order to have a response and to say that this actually does exist. So I think there's something about that as well. I'm going to turn to Jenny.
Thank you for an amazing conversation.
So the question is there a danger of seeing rape as sort of isolated incidents rather than, as Salamisha has pointed out, an epidemic that we're experiencing worldwide and globally?
I mean, I think that was a really good answer, Jerome. The question is, what's the question? It was a really good analysis. What's the question?
The question is basically asking, how do we not see these as individual isolated incidents of rape? Yeah.
That sometimes that I think that if we reject the criminal legal system as a model, we turn to this other deeply problematic model that pathologizes lots of things. So when I heard the question about poverty, it made me think about how poverty has been pathologized, particularly among Black women, but also that language, that like inherited, that language of inheritance, of like passing on this. It's tempting, right? Because it's in some ways a rejection of the legal model that we know is primarily or fundamentally unjust. But it's troublesome too.
You're talking about like public health when you say.
Well, I don't know. There's something like the notion of what it means to say that something is an epidemic and not a disease. I was just really struck by that. Maybe you could talk about what that meant. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how a lot of the high-profile sexual harassment cases or strange cases, and like Anthony Weiner is not necessarily sexual harassment, but that there's a way in which the media and oftentimes the actual individuals kind of make claims for having a disease, like, and with Mayor Filner in San Diego, he went into like rehab, and so I'm always interested in how rehab or certain other euphemisms take over the conversation when in fact what we're talking about is gender inequality and gender violence. And so I just wanted to say, well, you know, again, I guess the whole thing I'm trying to get us to understand is that if you keep on adding up these patterns, we'll see it as an epidemic, right? And so that is part of what I want us to understand. And then in terms of, and I think this is, it's an ongoing conversation about where the law is useful and where it isn't. And I think, you know, part of, you could take from what I'm saying about George Zimmerman is like, what would have happened if he were punished earlier for the sexual assault of his cousin or for acts of domestic violence? Like, what would have, you know, and so where does the legal system enter in a way that may be useful, and where does it fail? And so I think it's just, I think when Beth says she doesn't have all the answers, for me, it's a struggle as a survivor of violence, but also as someone who just keeps on wondering, like, what kinds of interventions need to happen earlier in order for these other forms of violence not to happen? And so, you know, it's just, I'm trying to figure it out myself, like in real time right now.
Okay, I'm going to be able to take two last hands. I'm going to take both questions, and then we'll let the panel respond. So Nicole, and then I saw a hand back there. Okay. So Nicole first.
Hi, I'm not sure how to specifically put my question together as a lot of people with switches been mentioned. I've been thinking a lot recently about, you know, the other piece that is missing is that of sort of how we form or what kind of activism can we do to sort of prevent those who perpetrate violence, sexual violence,
get that last part.
Yeah, black male, we can do black male rapists.
Okay, so I think that what you're asking, I don't know. I think what I'm hearing is, what kinds of structural changes do we need to make to prevent violence against women, especially if we're not looking at, punitive measures taken by the criminal legal system. And then also, how do we challenge this myth of the black male rapist that continues to be pervasive in media and popular culture? Okay, yeah, we're going to take the second question. Sorry, I just had to get my head around that first.
So I just wanted to talk about rape culture again, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tasha Minot, comedian. I think 2 years ago we had a live show where he has a number of rape jokes, and it sparked a whole conversation because
guy named goes by Tosh 2.0 has a show on Comedy Central.
Pointed her out and said, wouldn't it be funny if this was working? And a lot of people are funny. So how do we address that? The idea that we can't, stop at freedom of speech in comedy is in a way that there's no way that we can limit the topics that they can address. But as a force of what can be talked about and what can be seen as funny, how do we address that within this question of rape culture? I'm not sure if that can be.
Right. So I think that the question, there was an example of a comedian making sexist, chauvinist jokes and actually suggesting that a woman in the audience be gang raped right there and then, and the audience, many people in the audience actually laughed. So how do we actually challenge that without necessarily censoring comedy or censoring anybody? How do we effectively challenge that without censorship?
Daniel Tosh.
Daniel Tosh was the comedian.
Oh, yeah. The freedom of speech argument is such a red herring from my perspective, in terms of like really addressing kind of the issue of sexual violence and humor, in like specifically addressing sexual violence and humor. Because the freedom of speech is not the freedom of speech, it's not the freedom to say anything without consequence. Right? So the fact that someone can say something and is free to say something is not, to me, the issue. The issue that a lot of people jumped on was that there was any kind of consequence to what he said, that he was getting called out for what he said. And I think sometimes we do silence ourselves because we're afraid. We don't want to get called, we don't want to be called censors. We don't want to be suggesting that, like, that we don't believe in the First Amendment. It kind of goes down that road. And I actually think that road is a complete red herring. The issue to me is not whether or not he can say what he can say. The issue is whether we provide a consequence to that and whether we then back it up by calling out the corporate sponsors of that comedy show, right? He doesn't have a right to a corporate sponsorship. There's no reason we can't call that out. There's no reason we can't call out the fact that that was completely sexist and was absolutely a perfect example of how rape culture operates and how women are silenced in public discourse. Gail Stern, who's one of the co-founders of Catharsis Productions, which is a locally based organization that does work around sexual violence, she recently wrote a long piece and has written other work specifically about humor and sexual violence. So I would encourage you to check that out. But one of the things she says is that true comedy punches up, not down. And so you have to consider, like, who's the butt of the joke, right? Is it the person who is most disenfranchised and who has the least power? And is that truly comedy? So I think that, this is a pet peeve of mine, to be called out as though it's like a freedom of speech issue. It's not a freedom of speech issue. People want to be free of consequence, and that they do not have a right to.
I also want to ask the panel to address Nicole's questions, earlier questions?
Yeah, so I was going to address that. So I used to work as a direct service crisis counselor at Stroger Hospital, and through that work, you know, I was in the emergency room and the trauma room, and I would come across women who were there as a result of violence, and would offer them services. And one of those was to just lead community circles. So when we're thinking about the dichotomy of, you know, like whether we should call the police or not, you know, whether we should involve sort of like these legal institutions, I think that it boils down to what the victim wants to do, right? What does the survivor want to do? And sometimes the alternatives could be to just offer a space where, you know, people who have just survived sexual assault or rape or any kind of violence, for them to just have a space to process, right? And so in these community gatherings, that's exactly what it was. It was an alternative to going to the police or, you know, seeking other forms of services. So a lot of times, like, women would meet in these spaces, and then they would sort of go and build off of that, you know. Like, I remember I had a program participant that opened up part of her house and sort of would do women's hair and women's nails who were survivors of violence, who just, you know, would go there to get pampered, right? So I think that sometimes we are looking for big solutions, and sometimes some of the simple solutions are just as good, right? Then there's also restorative and transformative justice practice. So again, a lot of this is centered around healing circles and really processing within people and networks that we feel safe with. Yeah, and I think that's it. But I will say, as a survivor of violence, I have been in situations or I was in a situation where I called the police on one of my abusers, and then when the police ended up getting there, they proceeded to call me the B word, to say that, you know, I was acting really crazy and that I was wasting their time because there were many more important things that they could be doing. And so as someone who has been in that position, I'm not someone that would call, you know, I wouldn't call the police, you know, but at times I have thought about it, you know. So again, I think it depends on the situation, the context. In one case, you might want to call the police, and in another, you might not. So it's not about having like a prescribed response. It's really about how we evolve and also how our alternatives evolve.
Just to add to that, Claudia, I'm glad you brought up the possibilities of restorative and transformative justice, but also really listening to what survivors need at any given moment. That's critical. It's also, I think, important to think that we, as activists, have really narrowed what the possibilities are for survivors to do. And so we invested huge amounts of time and political energy into developing things like mandatory arrest laws, right? Remember looking at people who I know who are part of this with me. We never said mandatory arrest and mandatory housing and mandatory childcare and mandatory job. That's what women need. So that if you're the survivor who says, I want the police to come and treat me respectfully and remove him from this environment because that will keep me safe, that's one option. If what I need is a safe place to live with my kids, we mandate that that happens, or mandate that you will get health care. So part of the issue is that the work, both the local work that we do in hospitals and rape crisis centers and battered women's programs all around the country, but also the national work that supports that local work, is all about arrest. And not that individual decisions about arrest are the wrong decision, but more that if that's all we offer people, then for certain groups of people and for certain individuals at certain times, that simply won't work. And I think that's the lesson learned. That's the cautionary tale, I think, that we need to move forward, thinking about other alternatives that will really help people more. Not that calling the police is right or wrong, but more if that's the only option that people have, given how the carceral state is organized, we will in fact increase violence, not decrease it.
Okay. I'm going to ask Salamisha to give us the last word, and then I want to invite all of you to join us for a reception in the other room. So, Salamisha.
No, actually, thank you. You know, I hadn't, well, of course I thought about it when I did the presentation in terms of what types of perpetrators I was depicting. But one, it's just factually accurate that I think the stats are about 95% of sexual assaults that take place in the US are by white men, right? Just because of just that's the numbers. And then within racial categories, though, it's interracial, so African American women are more likely to be raped by African American men, Latina women, so that's about 90%, right? So there's a couple of things that I'm trying to point out here. One, that the demographics that I was trying to show, those men some are men of color, some are understood to be, in the Boston bombing, they didn't really know what to do with men who looked white, but then were from this area in Chechnya, so there's a way in which they're raced in proximity to black men, but not quite black men. So there's always that going on in the criminalization of Americans in general. But for me, as an activist and someone who's really invested in having African American men as part of this movement, it's been important to understand the ways in which African American men may feel alienated from the women's movement or from the anti-violence movement, and also to figure out new and innovative ways to recruit them as allies and as leaders. And so that's a real just issue for me as a person, but also because I've been sexually assaulted by African American or black men, one man in Kenya, one in the United States. I feel like it drives me in terms of prevention, right? If you can get to young black boys right now and for them to be like feminists, what does that look like? What does that mean? And what does that mean for their own freedom, right? I do believe that gender equality empowers all people, and children in particular. So I guess I just feel like there's a deliberateness to what I was doing, but without using the word intersectional, right? But it's all intersectional. It drives everything I do. That's what I was trying to get at, as well as broadening who we think of as perpetrators of gender-based violence as well. So I don't know. Okay, that's my answer.
Okay, thank you to Salamisha, thank you to all of the panelists.